two of California's most infamous unsolved crimes. The brutal murder of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, and the mysterious killings of the Zodiac Killer. For decades, these cases were treated as completely unrelated. Different victims, different eras, different methods. But some investigators believe the truth could be far more disturbing, because hidden inside one of the Zodiac Killer's unsolved ciphers may be the name of a man connected to Elizabeth Short. And if that's true, the Black Dahlia murder might not just be a Hollywood-era mystery. It might have been the Zodiac Killer's first known crime. In January 1947, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. She had been brutally murdered and carefully posed, shocking even experienced detectives. The media quickly gave her a haunting nickname, the Black Dahlia. Despite a massive investigation and hundreds of suspects, the killer was never identified, turning the case into one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. There is no blood at the location, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw the killing happen. Who could do something like this? But answers do not come. Instead, something even more chilling arrives. A letter. A man contacts a newspaper claiming responsibility for the murder. Soon after, a package is delivered containing Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, her birth certificate, her address book, items that should only have been in the killer's possession. Inside is a message. The writer calls himself the Black Dahlia Avenger. And then, just like that, he disappears. Police chase lead after lead. More than 1,000 suspects are looked at over time. Doctors, soldiers, drifters, lovers, men who knew her, men who only claimed to know her. But no one is ever charged. The case slowly hardens into legend. An unsolved murder frozen in time. Years pass, then decades, and the truth behind the Black Dahlia killing seems destined to remain buried forever. But 20 years later, hundreds of miles to the north, another nightmare begins. A young couple, David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, sits in a parked car near Vallejo on a quiet December night in 1968. It is an ordinary scene, the kind of place teenagers go for privacy, never imagining that anyone is watching. Then headlights appear behind them. Another car pulls up slowly. For a moment, they think it might be a police officer. Then the driver steps out. Seconds later, gunshots rip through the dark. The young man is shot in the head. The young woman tries to escape, but bullets tear through her back as she runs. The killer turns and walks away. Calmly. No witnesses can identify him. There is no clear motive. No obvious reason these two were targeted. But the strangest part comes later. Weeks after the attack, 3 Bay Area newspapers receive letters. Inside are pieces of a coded message and a confession. The writer describes the murders in disturbing detail, proving he knows things only the killer should know. Then he signs one of the letters with words that will become infamous. This is the Zodiac speaking. With that single line, the Zodiac Killer introduces himself to the world. And he will not stop there. The confirmed victims of the Zodiac Killer include David Arthur Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16. Shot and killed on December 20, 1968, on Lake Herman Road in Benicia. Michael Renaud Mageau, 19, and Darlene Elizabeth Farron, 22. Shot around midnight between July 4th and 5th, 1969, in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Mageau survived the attack, but Farron later died at Kaiser Foundation Hospital. Brian Calvin Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia and Shepard, 22, stabbed on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Hartnell survived, while Shepard died from her injuries on September 29 at Queen of the Valley Hospital. Paul Lee Stein, 29, shot and killed on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. Because Zodiac wants attention, he sends more letters, more codes, more threats. He taunts police. He mocks investigators. He demands newspapers publish his ciphers. He warns that he will keep killing. For months, Northern California lives in fear of a man nobody can identify. Witnesses describe a stocky man wearing glasses. Police sketches circulate everywhere. The entire region watches, waits, and wonders when he will strike again. And then, eventually, the murders stop. The letters slow. The trail goes cold. And just like that, Zodiac vanishes. Despite one of the largest investigations in California history, the Zodiac Killer is never caught. So for decades, these remained two separate legends of American true crime. The Black Dahlia, intimate, brutal, deeply personal. The Zodiac, taunting, theatrical, unpredictable. Two crimes, two killers, two mysteries that seem to belong to entirely different worlds. But years later, a controversial theory begins to emerge. A theory so disturbing that many investigators dismissed it immediately. What if these two famous unsolved crimes were never separate at all? What if the man who murdered Elizabeth Short in 1947 was the same man who would later terrorize Northern California as the Zodiac Killer? It sounds almost impossible, but some researchers believe the first clue may be hidden inside an unsolved Zodiac cipher. And if that clue means what they think it means, it points back to someone who knew Elizabeth Short personally. Because before she died, Elizabeth had reportedly been living with a man, and according to some accounts, she may have been afraid of him. That is where this story truly begins. Because in the old police files from 1947, his name does not stand out at first. It appears alongside dozens of others. Detectives interviewed countless people connected to Elizabeth Short in the final weeks of her life: friends, acquaintances, casual companions, men who knew her socially, men who claimed they barely knew her at all. But this particular man had something many of the others did not. He had lived with her. Not long before Elizabeth Short was murdered, she reportedly stayed in an apartment he shared with another man. By most accounts, the arrangement lasted only around 12 days. Then suddenly, she left. And according to some people who later spoke to investigators, she left because she was frightened. One acquaintance claimed Elizabeth had mentioned a former Marine who was looking for her, a man she seemed desperate to avoid. When one detective heard that detail, he reportedly leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "If she was hiding from someone, that someone needs to be at the top of our list." The man in question had served during World War II. Accounts of his life after the war suggest he struggled emotionally. Some descriptions portray him as withdrawn, unstable, and prone to anger. To detectives, none of that proved murder, but it did make him hard to ignore. Then there was another detail. A detail that kept resurfacing in conversations about Elizabeth Short's death. Precision. The condition of her body suggested control, not frenzy. The cuts appeared unusually clean. The mutilation seemed methodical. For years, investigators suspected the killer may have had some knowledge of anatomy, perhaps medical training, surgical experience, or at least familiarity with how the human body could be cut with disturbing efficiency. One investigator reportedly put it bluntly: this wasn't done by someone panicking. This was done by someone who took their time. The man Elizabeth had lived with had reportedly spent time around medical environments. Again, it was not proof, but it was another detail that kept his name alive in the file. He denied involvement. Police could not place him at the crime scene. There was no physical evidence strong enough to justify charges. So, like many other promising leads in the Black Dahlia investigation, the trail faded. But his name never truly disappeared. It just sat there in the file, waiting. Then, years later, attention shifted to one of the Zodiac Killer's most frustrating mysteries, a short, unsolved code now known as the Z13 cipher. Only 13 characters long, it has resisted definitive decoding for decades. Cryptographers, amateur sleuths, and investigators have all tried to crack it. Unlike longer Zodiac ciphers, there is simply not enough text to make certainty easy. But one cold case researcher studying Zodiac's letters approached it with a different question. What if the cipher did not hide a sentence? What if it hid a name? Zodiac had hinted more than once that he might reveal his identity. And if he saw the entire investigation as a game, a performance, then burying his name inside a cipher would be exactly the kind of taunt he might enjoy. So the researcher began testing possibilities. Thousands of names, then millions. He compared letter patterns, substitution possibilities, and structures loosely connected to other Zodiac messages. And eventually, one name kept appearing in his work. The same name sitting quietly in the old Black Dahlia files. The same man who had once lived with Elizabeth Short. When the investigator realized the overlap, the theory suddenly became much darker. If that cipher really pointed to this man, then the suspect tied to Elizabeth Short in 1947 might also be the Zodiac Killer more than 20 years later. Two unsolved mysteries. Two of California's most infamous crimes, potentially pointing toward the same person. Naturally, reactions were divided. Some investigators were intrigued. Others were openly skeptical. One retired detective reportedly looked at the theory and said, "You're telling me one man killed Elizabeth Short and then waited 20 years before becoming the Zodiac?" The researcher answered calmly, "I'm saying the possibility deserves a closer look." And that closer look revealed a series of troubling overlaps. Supporters of the theory began mapping the suspect's life, places he had lived, traveled through, or had ties to, and comparing those locations to Zodiac-related events. Some of the geography appeared to line up, not perfectly, but enough to raise eyebrows. Believers saw pattern. Skeptics saw coincidence. And in cold case investigations, that line is everything. But the theory grew stranger still. At some point years after the crimes, the suspect reportedly created a drawing, a sketch of a woman's torso. Next to it was a single name, Elizabeth. To some people, it meant nothing. To others, it felt deeply unsettling, because the image seemed to echo the condition in which Elizabeth Short's body had been found. When the sketch was shown to someone who knew the suspect personally, the reaction was immediate. "That's his handwriting," the man reportedly said. Moments like that are difficult to dismiss emotionally, even if they do not meet the standard of legal proof. And that is the central problem with this theory. It is full of things that are disturbing, suggestive, suspicious, but not definitive. There is no confirmed DNA tying this suspect to the Black Dahlia crime scene. There is no fingerprint placing him on a Zodiac letter with certainty. And without physical evidence, even a compelling theory can fall apart. But there is another obstacle too, one that may be even bigger: psychology. Because when criminologists compare the Black Dahlia murder to the Zodiac attacks, the differences are impossible to ignore. Elizabeth Short's killing appears personal, intimate, prolonged. The killer spent time with the body. He cleaned it, positioned it, staged it. The Zodiac attacks look completely different. Fast, explosive, detached, gunfire in the dark, sudden violence, quick exits. One criminologist summarized the contrast this way: the Dahlia killer looked like someone acting out something personal. Zodiac looked like someone playing a game. That difference is one of the strongest arguments against the theory. At first glance, these do not look like the same offender. But others push back, because killers do not always remain static. Over years, especially over decades, their methods can evolve. Circumstances change. Age changes. Opportunity changes. A man who committed one deeply personal murder in the 1940s might not commit murders the same way in the late 1960s. In fact, he may deliberately avoid repeating himself. One investigator studying the theory framed it this way: if someone got away with a crime as horrific as the Black Dahlia murder, he might realize something terrifying, that he could do it again. But he would also understand that repeating the same behavior might expose him. So he changes. New victims, new methods, new geography, and perhaps, most importantly, a new identity. That idea matters because Zodiac was not just a murderer. He was a persona. He wrote letters like a man performing for an audience. He cultivated fear. He invented a symbol. He turned murder into theater. And if that urge for attention really defined him, some believe it may not have started with Zodiac. Because the Black Dahlia killer also inserted himself into the story. The so-called Black Dahlia Avenger contacted the press. He mailed personal items. He controlled the narrative. Zodiac would later do something very similar. Of course, skeptics are quick to point out that many killers contact the media. That behavior alone proves nothing. And they are right. Still, the similarities are difficult to ignore. Both killers wanted power over the investigation. Both killers manipulated newspapers. Both killers seemed to enjoy forcing police to react. But once again, all roads lead back to the same problem: evidence. As one detective reportedly said, "You can build a beautiful theory, but if you can't put a fingerprint on it, it won't hold up." And in both the Black Dahlia and Zodiac cases, the lack of decisive physical evidence is exactly why these mysteries are still unsolved. The crime scenes are old. Forensic techniques at the time were limited. Some evidence was mishandled, contaminated, or lost. That leaves modern investigators trying to reconstruct certainty from fragments, whispers, and incomplete records. Still, the suspect at the center of this theory refuses to disappear from the conversation. Researchers point to periods in his life where his movements are unclear. They note different names and identities used at different times. They find timelines that appear, at least in places, to overlap with Zodiac-related events. Supporters say the pattern feels too strong to ignore. Critics argue that when a person's life is examined long enough and closely enough, patterns can be found almost anywhere. And that is the real tension at the heart of this mystery. The exact same set of details can look like a breakthrough, or like a mirage. By the time investigators reach the final pieces of the theory, that tension becomes unavoidable. On one side are those who believe the connection between the Black Dahlia and Zodiac is stronger than the public realizes. They see a man who knew Elizabeth Short, lived with her, may have frightened her, and had a background that could fit the precision of the murder. Then they see a cipher that may contain his name. To them, the two puzzles begin sliding into place. One investigator who supports the theory once said, "If this man is Zodiac, then the first victim we know about might have been Elizabeth Short." It is a chilling thought. A killer beginning with one deeply personal murder in 1947, then resurfacing decades later as a taunting serial murderer who would become one of the most notorious unidentified killers in American history. But the skeptics remain just as firm. They point out that the behavioral gap between the two crimes is enormous. One is careful and intimate. The other is abrupt and theatrical. One lingers with the victim. The other often strikes and leaves. For many profilers, that kind of change would be extraordinary. One expert reportedly said, "If these crimes were committed by the same person, it would be one of the most dramatic behavioral shifts we've ever seen." Then there is the cipher itself. Short ciphers are notoriously dangerous territory. Because there are so few characters, multiple names and solutions can sometimes be forced into them. In other words, the suspect's name appearing in one interpretation of the code might be meaningful, or it might be coincidence. And coincidence is the enemy of certainty in every cold case. Still, supporters return to the same argument again and again. At some point, too many coincidences begin to feel like a pattern. The suspect knew Elizabeth Short. He had access to her. He may have frightened her. He had a background some believe fits the brutality and precision of her murder. His name may appear in the Zodiac cipher. His movements may align with some Zodiac-related events. None of that proves he was guilty of either crime. But together, it creates a theory investigators cannot dismiss lightly. And that is why this idea has endured, even now, even after all these years. Because whether the theory is right or wrong, it asks a question that is impossible to forget. What if two of America's most famous unsolved crimes have always been connected? What if the man who murdered Elizabeth Short did not stop? What if he changed, evolved, reinvented himself? And what if the name investigators have been searching for in one case has been sitting in the shadows of the other all along? For now, the truth remains out of reach. Too much time has passed. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Evidence has been lost. In the Black Dahlia case, usable DNA has always been difficult to recover. In the Zodiac case, some letters have yielded partial genetic material, but nothing that has definitively identified the killer. So the final answer remains trapped somewhere in the past. Maybe the man who killed Elizabeth Short died decades ago without ever facing justice. Maybe the Zodiac Killer did too. Or maybe they were the same person all along. Right now, that remains only a theory. A disturbing one. A fascinating one. But still, only a theory. And that is where the story ends. Not with certainty. Not with a name carved in stone. But with a possibility so unsettling that it continues to haunt investigators, true crime researchers, and anyone drawn to the darkest unsolved corners of American history. Did the Zodiac Killer also murder the Black Dahlia? No one can answer that for sure. Not yet. But the possibility remains one of the most chilling ideas ever attached to either case. And sometimes, in true crime, the most disturbing mysteries are not the ones with no suspects at all, but the ones where the answer may have been hiding in plain sight the entire time. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Turn on your notification, like, comment, and share for more unsolved mysteries and true crime stories. Do you believe the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Killer could have been the same man? Or are the differences between the crimes simply too great to ignore? Because in cases like these, the discussion never really ends. And sometimes, the breakthrough begins with the question nobody was supposed to ask.